She stood at the edge of the room while men shook hands over her future. No one asked her name. No one looked at her face. Her father gripped the banker's palm like he was closing the deal of his life. Because he was. Lena Ashcroft was 23 years old, the smartest person on that ranch, and in the span of one handshake, she had been reduced to a debt payment. But across that crowded dining room, one man wasn't celebrating. He wasn't even smiling. He just looked at her. And for the first time all evening, someone actually saw her. Stay with me. This story will break your heart before it puts it back together. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button and become part of our storytelling family. You do not want to miss what's coming. Drop a like and tell me in the comments, what city or country are you watching from? I want to see how far this story travels. The dinner had been Eleanor Ashcroft's idea. That was the cruelest part of it. The tablecloth was pressed, the candles were lit, the good china that only came out for Christmas and funerals sat gleaming under the chandelier light, and Eleanor had done all of it herself because she believed this night was something worth celebrating. Lena had set the table beside her mother that afternoon, folding napkins into neat triangles, arranging the silverware the way her mother had taught her when she was 7 years old. She hadn't known then what the dinner was for. She'd thought maybe her father had sold the South pasture. Maybe they'd finally pulled the mortgage back from the edge. She found out at 7:15 when Grant Holloway walked through the front door of the Ashcroft ranch house and shook her father's hand for a full 5 seconds too long. Grant Holloway was 41 years old. He had the kind of face that looked generous at a distance and calculated up close, wide jaw, careful eyes, a smile that arrived slightly after it should have, like it was a decision rather than a reflex. He wore a coat that cost more than any single piece of equipment on the Ashcroft property. He smelled like cedar and money. Miss Ashcroft. He'd taken her hand, bowed slightly over it. Your father speaks very highly of you. Does he? Lena said. It wasn't a question. Her father, Thomas Ashcroft, laughed. That big barrel-chested laugh he used when he was nervous and needed to fill silence fast. Lena's being modest. She runs half this ranch, whether she admits it or not. Is that right? Holloway's eyes moved across her face the way a man assesses something he's considering purchasing. Not cruel about it, just thorough. A capable woman. That's hard to find. Lena smiled because her mother was watching, and her mother had spent 40 years learning to smile at moments exactly like this one, and some things get passed down whether you want them or not. The meal itself was unbearable in the quiet way that only family dinners can be. Her mother kept refilling Holloway's water glass. Her father kept steering the conversation toward the ranch's history, its acreage, its potential. Potential being a word Thomas Ashcroft had been leaning on for the better part of a decade, ever since the beef prices dropped, and the North Well went dry and the bank started sending letters with a particular kind of formality that meant business. Lena ate. She listened. She watched her father's hands, the way he gripped his fork too tight, the way his jaw worked even when he wasn't chewing. Thomas Ashcroft was a proud man. She had never once seen him comfortable asking for anything, which meant that whatever he was working up to tonight had been eating him alive for weeks. The ranch hands were eating in the bunkhouse. She could see the yellow rectangle of light from its window through the dining room glass. 12 men. Their wages were 3 weeks behind. She knew because she kept the books. When dessert came, her mother's apple cake, the one reserved for Christmas and funerals, Thomas Ashcroft set down his fork, cleared his throat, and said, Grant, I think it's time we talked about the arrangement. The word arrangement landed in Lena's chest like a stone dropped into still water. I've been thinking about it since we spoke in town, Holloway said, folding his hands on the table. And I want you to know, Thomas, that I'm a man who keeps his word. I know you are. The debt gets cleared, every cent of it. I'll take on the operating line personally, give you room to breathe through next season. He paused. In exchange, you'll have my daughter's hand, Thomas Ashcroft said it flatly, like a man who has rehearsed a line until it stopped sounding like what it was. Lena set down her fork. The sound of it touching the china was the loudest thing in the room. She looked at her father. He didn't look back at her. He was watching Holloway the way a man watches a river he's trying to cross, calculating, cautious, committed. Lena, her mother's voice soft and urgent from across the table. I'm fine, Lena said, Her voice came out even. She was distantly impressed by that. Grant Holloway turned to her with that careful smile. I hope this isn't entirely unwelcome news, Miss Ashcroft. I've been a widower for 4 years. I'm not looking for a trophy. I'm looking for a partner. A partner, she repeated. A real one. Someone who understands land, business, the realities of frontier life. He leaned forward slightly. Someone capable. She thought about saying, then hire a foreman. She thought about saying, you're 41 years old and you went looking for a wife in another man's debt ledger. She thought about saying a great number of things, each one more satisfying and more ruinous than the last. Instead, she said, I'll need some time. Of course, Holloway said, magnanimous, as though he had not just been promised her by her own father 2 sentences ago. Thomas Ashcroft finally looked at her then. There was something in his face she hadn't expected. Not triumph, not coldness, but a kind of exhausted desperation. The look of a man who has run out of every other option and hates himself for it. It should have made her angrier. Somehow, it only made everything heavier. Guests arrived after dinner. That was the part she hadn't anticipated. Apparently word had traveled, the way word always traveled in small ranch communities, ahead of itself and slightly wrong. The Durans came. The Kellys. Old Pastor Whitmore and his wife. The foreman from the neighboring Callaway spread. A dozen people filling up the Ashcroft parlor, someone producing a bottle of good whiskey. The word congratulations being said by people who didn't fully know what they were congratulating, but understood it was the kind of event that called for it. Lena stood at the edge of the parlor with a glass of water she wasn't drinking and accepted the handshakes and the warm shoulder squeezes and the your father must be so relieved with a face she had spent her whole life learning to arrange into something presentable. Nobody asked her how she felt. Not really. The women said she must be excited. The men talked to her father. Grant Holloway held court near the fireplace, comfortable, confident, already behaving like a man who belonged here. She was watching him talk, watching the way he held his glass, the way he laughed at exactly the right moments, when she became aware that someone was not watching Holloway at all. Someone was watching her. She turned. He was standing near the far wall, a little apart from the other ranch hands who had apparently been invited in for the occasion, or perhaps summoned the way you summon witnesses. Wade Mercer. He'd been at the Ashcroft Ranch for 8 months, arriving on a gray October morning with a bedroll, a horse, and the kind of quiet competence that foremen recognized before they could explain why. He was not the tallest man in the room or the most imposing. He was 32, maybe 33, with the kind of face that wasn't handsome so much as settled. Like everything that needed to sort itself out had already done so, a long time ago. He had a way of looking at things directly that some people mistook for bluntness. It wasn't bluntness. It was just attention. He was giving her all of his right now. Not pity. She would have turned away from pity. Not awkwardness or the careful neutral expression people use when they don't know what to say. He was just looking at her the way you look at someone when you've seen something that matters and you're not going to pretend you didn't. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked away. When she looked back, he'd moved. He was crossing the room. Not toward the fireplace, not toward the cluster of celebrating neighbors. Toward her, straight and unhurried, with the same quality of purpose he brought to everything. He stopped a few feet from her. Miss Ashcroft. Mercer. He didn't say congratulations. He didn't say your father must be relieved. He didn't say anything designed to smooth over what was obviously happening in this room. He just stood there for a moment, and then he said quietly, You want some air? She looked at him. Back door's clear, he said. Nobody'll notice for a few minutes. It was such a small thing, such an ordinary thing. But she had been standing in this room for the better part of an hour, having her future discussed around her like she was a piece of pasture land, and the simple fact of someone asking what she wanted, even something as small as air, cracked something open in her chest that she'd been working very hard to keep sealed. Yes, she said, I do. The night air hit her face and she exhaled for what felt like the first time in hours. The back porch of the Ashcroft ranch house looked east, away from the barn and the bunkhouse, out toward the long dark sweep of the valley where the grass came up black in the moonlight and the fence posts ran in crooked rows all the way to the tree line. It was her favorite view on the property. She'd eaten breakfast looking at it most mornings of her life. Wade came out behind her and stood on the steps, not beside her but slightly below, hands in his pockets, looking out at the same stretch of darkness. "You don't have to say anything," she said before he could. "I know. Half these people would tell me I should be grateful. I know that too." She turned to look at him. "But you're not going to." "No, ma'am," he said simply. "I'm not." She'd expected. She wasn't sure what she'd expected. Comfort, maybe. Some version of "it'll work itself out" or "your father's doing what he thinks is right." She'd gotten those from her mother, and she'd smiled through all of them, and they'd sat in her stomach like stones. Wade didn't offer any of it. He just stood there on the porch steps in the dark, being present in the specific, uncomplicated way that some rare people know how to be present, not filling the space with words that were really just about their own discomfort. "His cattle operation went under 2 years ago," Lena said after a moment. "Holloway's, did you know that?" Wade glanced at her. "He rebuilt it through banking, through other people's land, other people's trouble." She looked back out at the valley. "He's good at that, finding people at the right moment." "And your father's at that moment." "My father's been at that moment for 4 years." She pressed her lips together. "I've known it. I've been trying to... I had a plan. I've been working on it for months. If we restructure the grazing rotation, bring the cattle weight up before fall market, cut the operating costs on the east section..." She stopped. "I had a plan," she said again, quieter. Wade was quiet for a moment, then, "What's wrong with the plan?" "Nothing." She heard the edge in her own voice. "Nothing is wrong with the plan. It would work. It would take 2 seasons, maybe 3, but it would work. The problem is my father doesn't believe a plan is real unless a man in a suit hands it to him on paper." The words came out harder than she'd meant them to. She waited for him to flinch, to hedge, to say something diplomatic. He just nodded slowly. "That's a hard thing." "Yes," she said. "It is." They stood there for a while. Out across the valley, a coyote called once, high and thin, and went quiet. The light in the bunkhouse window flickered. Someone adjusting the lamp. "I should go back in," she said. "Probably." She didn't move. "Mercer." "Yeah." "Whatever you saw in there tonight..." She kept her eyes on the valley. "I'd appreciate it if it stayed out here." He was quiet for just a second, then, "Saw what?" She almost smiled. It surprised her, the almost. "Good night," she said. "Good night, Miss Ashcroft." She went back inside. The party was still going, the whiskey still flowing, her father laughing too loud near the fireplace. Grant Holloway looked up when she re-entered the room and smiled that calculated smile, and she smiled back, and she was very good at it by now, and it cost her almost nothing. But she carried the cool night air back in with her, and she carried the memory of a man who had asked her if she wanted some air instead of telling her she should be grateful, and for the first time since the handshake at 7 o'clock, the weight in her chest was something she thought she might be able to carry. She lay awake that night for a long time. The house settled and creaked around her the way old ranch houses do, the wood talking to itself in the dark. Down the hall, she could hear her parents' murmured voices, her mother asking something, her father answering in that low, finished way he used when he didn't want to be questioned further. She stared at the ceiling. She was 23 years old. She had spent those 23 years learning this ranch, every acre, every fence post, every seasonal rhythm, every market trend, every way the grass behaved in drought, and the way the cattle moved when weather was coming. She could read a balance sheet at a glance, and she could read cattle health at a glance, and she had, quietly and without being asked, kept this operation from collapsing at least twice in the last 4 years through choices her father thought he'd made himself. And tonight, her father had sold her future to pay a debt that didn't have to exist. She could be angry about it. She was angry about it. But anger, she had learned, was a clean-burning fuel. It went fast and it left you empty. What she needed was something that lasted longer. What she needed was a plan. Not the grazing rotation plan, not the market timing strategy. Those were still good. Those were still real. What she needed was a plan for herself. for what came next, for how a woman on a frontier ranch with no money and no legal claim to anything she'd spent her life building was supposed to find a way to live on her own terms. She didn't have that plan yet, but she had noticed something tonight, something small and easily missed, the kind of thing that only matters if you're paying attention. There was a man on this ranch who had looked at her like she was a person. She'd work with what she had. The morning after the dinner party, Lena was up before the sun. That wasn't unusual. She'd been an early riser since childhood, pulled awake by some internal clock that refused to let her sleep past the first gray light. But this morning felt different from the inside. Sharper, like the night before had scraped something off her and left the raw surface exposed to the cold air. She dressed in the dark, pulled her boots on at the kitchen table, and was out the door before her mother's lamp came on down the hall. The ranch in the early morning had a particular quality she'd never been able to describe to anyone who hadn't grown up on one. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of small sounds, the cattle shifting in the pen, the horses moving in the barn, the creak of the windmill turning slow against a light wind. She walked the fence line along the east pasture the way she did most mornings, not because it needed walking, but because it helped her think, and she had a great deal to think about. Grant Holloway had sent a note that morning. She'd found it on the kitchen table when she came downstairs, her father already out, her mother setting coffee on the stove with the careful movements of a woman navigating around a conversation she didn't want to have. The note was formal and polite and said something about hoping she'd had a restful evening and that he looked forward to calling on her at the end of the week. She'd left it on the table. She hadn't thrown it away because that would have required a decision she wasn't ready to announce yet. She just left it there, like a problem she was setting aside to solve later. What she couldn't set aside was the ranch. The South herd had been restless the past 2 days. She'd noticed it before the dinner party, but hadn't had time to investigate. 3 cows in particular were showing signs of something, moving slow, not eating well, separating from the others. It could be nothing. It could be the early stage of something that would spread through the whole herd if she ignored it another day. She was coming around the corner of the barn to check on them when she nearly walked into Wade Mercer. He was carrying a bucket in each hand heading toward the trough, and he stopped when he saw her. For a half-second they just looked at each other, the way 2 people look at each other the morning after something that shifted when neither of them is entirely sure yet what the new ground rules are. "Miss Ashcroft," he said. "Mercer." She nodded toward the south pasture. "The roan cow and those 2 she runs with. You see them this morning?" Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise exactly, but something like recognition. "Yeah, I was going to say something to your father." "Say it to me." She said it without thinking, and then held it. Didn't take it back, didn't soften it. "What do you see?" He set the buckets down. "Lethargy, off feed. The roan's got some discharge around her eyes I don't like." He glanced toward the south pasture. "Could be early pink eye. Could be something moving through the herd." "I thought pink eye too. Is the light bothering her?" She was keeping her head down in that northeast corner so it stays in shade when she can. Lena was already moving past him toward the pasture gate. "We need to separate all 3 today, before they're in contact with the others at feeding." He fell into step beside her without being asked. That was something she noticed about Wade. He didn't wait to be directed toward what was obvious. Some ranch hands needed everything explained twice and still got it wrong. Wade seemed to operate off the same set of assumptions she did, which was either very useful or very unsettling, and right now she didn't have the bandwidth to figure out which. They spent the next 2 hours separating the 3 cows, getting them into the small isolation pen behind the north barn, cleaning the roan's eyes, and treating them with what the ranch medicine kit had, which wasn't much. Lena made a list in her head, what they needed from town, what it would cost, whether the supply account had enough credit left to cover it. The supply account almost certainly did not have enough credit left to cover it. "I can ride into Harlan this afternoon," Wade said when she mentioned the medication. "If you write down what's needed." The account at Duffy's might be tapped out. He didn't flinch at that. "I've got a few dollars I can put toward it." She looked at him sharply. "No. It's not charity. I'll put it on account with the ranch. You can square it when—" "No," she said again, quieter but no less firm. "I'll figure out the account. Just let me handle that part." He nodded once, didn't push it. That restraint, the way he could take a no without turning it into a negotiation, was something she was starting to notice the same way you notice a sound you've been hearing for a while without realizing it. As it turned out, she called in a favor from her mother's cousin, who ran the feed store in Harlan, and the medicine arrived the next morning with a promise to settle the bill in 60 days. It wasn't a solution, it was a delay. But on a working ranch, sometimes delays were the difference between disaster and just a very bad week. The roan started improving by the third day. The other two followed. The herd stayed clean. Lena crossed the entry off her mental ledger and moved on to the next problem. There were always more problems. What changed? What she only understood gradually, the way you understand gradual things, was that she stopped facing them alone. It happened without announcement, without either of them marking it as a shift. She would be out checking the fence along the creek bed, and Wade would show up with the wire stretcher because he'd seen the weak section the same time she had. She would be running numbers at the kitchen table on Sunday evening, and he would stop by to report on the week's work, and somehow the report would turn into a conversation about whether they should move the yearlings to the north pasture before or after the predicted cold snap, and the conversation would stretch an hour past dark. He never came inside, but he'd stand at the door, hat in his hands, leaning against the frame, but the boundary between a report and a real discussion had gone porous in a way she found hard to define. He knew the land. That was clear early on, but what surprised her was how well he listened. Not just to her, but to the ranch itself. He could look at the grass and tell you whether it had been overgrazed at the root level or just looked thin from a dry spell. He could watch cattle move across a pasture and read the pattern the way other people read weather. He had a kind of intelligence that didn't come with a ledger or a degree, and it operated in the exact spaces where hers left off. Hers operated where his left off too, which was a thing she filed away without examining too closely. One morning in late October, the kind of morning that couldn't decide between fall and winter, she found him fixing the hinge on the main gate, the big iron gate at the property entrance that had been drooping for 2 months and that her father had been meaning to deal with. "My father said he was going to hire the blacksmith from town for that," she said. Wade didn't look up from what he was doing. "Blacksmith would charge $12. Takes about 20 minutes if you know what you're doing." She watched him work. His hands were competent and unhurried, the way all his movements were. Not slow, just not wasteful. "Do you know what you're doing?" "So far," he said. She almost smiled. That happened more often now than it used to. When he was done, she pushed the gate open and it swung true and quiet. No drag, no complaint. He stepped back and looked at it the way craftsmen look at corrected things. Not pride exactly, just a settling. "My father's going to think he hired that done," she said. Wade looked at her sideways. There was the smallest suggestion of amusement at the corner of his mouth. "Long as it works." It was such a small exchange. There was no particular reason for it to stay with her, but it did. The way small honest things sometimes lodge in you when you've been surrounded by large dishonest ones for too long. The week after, the first real storm of the season came through. It gave them about 6 hours of warning. A change in the air pressure, the cattle bunching, the way the clouds came in from the northwest with that flat gray ceiling that meant business. Lena had seen enough Wyoming storms to read the signs, and she spent those 6 hours in a controlled, escalating panic that probably looked like calm efficiency to anyone watching. She had 16 yearlings in the east pasture with no shelter access because the lean-to roof had been compromised by the last windstorm and she hadn't gotten to it yet. If the temperature dropped as fast as the sky suggested it would, and those yearlings got wet and cold and couldn't get out of the wind, she was looking at losses. Real losses. The kind that didn't recover easily. She was in the east pasture trying to sort out what could be done about the lean-to when Wade came over the hill on horseback with 2 other hands. Denny, who'd been with the ranch 5 years, and a younger kid named Corbett, who was strong and willing but still learning everything. "Denny said the lean-to roof," Wade said, pulling up. He was already scanning the structure. "I need to get it covered before this hits. If I lose those yearlings..." "We're not going to lose them." He swung down from the horse and was already moving toward the lean-to before the words were finished. "There's tarp in the equipment shed," she said. "Top shelf, left side. And we're going to need..." "I know where the tarp is." She stopped, looked at him. He looked back at her, not with impatience, just with that same direct attention he always brought. "I've been in that shed every day for 8 months," he said simply. "You go get the calves out of the low corner. The drainage will run right through there. I'll take the roof." For 1/2 second, she thought about asserting the point, the instinctive reflex of someone who has had to fight to be heard about her own ranch her entire life. Then she looked at the sky, looked at the lean-to, looked at him. "The calves first," she agreed. "Don't let Corbett get on that roof alone. The angle's worse than it looks. Got it?" They worked for the next 3 hours in the kind of focused, barely communicating rhythm that only comes when people already understand each other. The tarp went up, not perfectly. It was a storm repair, not a renovation, but good enough, secured well enough to hold through what was coming. Lena got the calves shifted to the upper ground. Denny reinforced the gate latches on the main pen. Corbett, under Wade's watch, helped run the rope ties on the tarp without falling off anything. The storm hit at 4:30 in the afternoon. It was bad. Not devastating, not the kind of storm that broke ranches, but the kind that tested them. Howling wind, driving sleet, temperature dropping 15 degrees in 2 hours. Lena stayed out until her fingers were numb, walking the pens, doing head counts, checking on the isolation pen where the roan was still recovering. She found Wade doing the same thing, working the opposite side of the property. They met at the fence between the east and north pastures, both of them soaked, both of them doing the math in their heads. "East herd?" she asked. "All up. Lean-tos holding. North pen?" "Latches held. Lost one fence post on the far corner, but the wire's still up." She exhaled. The sleet was coming sideways. "Okay." He looked at her for a second. "You're going to get sick if you stay out here." "You're still out here." "I'm used to it." "So am I." He didn't argue with that, which was the right choice. Instead, he said, "One more pass on the south fence and then there's nothing left to do tonight. The cattle are where they need to be." "One more pass?" she agreed. They did it together, not because it required two people, but because neither of them was ready to stop. And at some point over the past weeks, they had developed the kind of working partnership where the company was just part of the operation, as natural as checking on the water trough. They lost one fence post on the south side too. Nothing else. By any frontier measurement, that was a victory. Her father assessed the damage the next morning, walked the property with his hands in his coat pockets, and told the foreman that the ranch had come through clean because he'd been careful about preparations. Lena was in the barn when she heard him say it. She stood there for a moment with a brush in her hand and a horse that needed attending, and she thought very carefully about several things she could say, and then she turned back to the horse and said, "None of them." Wade was across the barn, forking hay into the stalls. He'd heard it too. She could tell by the way he kept his eyes forward and his face neutral with the slight extra effort of a man making sure he keeps his face neutral. When her father had moved on, Wade said, without looking at her, "South fence post will need a new brace before the ground freezes. Shouldn't wait on it." "No," she said, "it shouldn't." That was all. But something about that exchange, the way he had seen what she'd seen and hadn't made it into a thing, had just moved forward to the next useful piece of work, settled in her chest with a quiet weight. Not comfort, exactly. Something more like solidarity. The specific warmth of being understood by someone who doesn't make a performance of understanding you. She was in complicated territory and she knew it. She was engaged, or as good as, in every way that anyone around here counted, to Grant Holloway. Holloway had begun calling at the house twice weekly, formal visits with her father's enthusiastic involvement, during which he sat in the good parlor chair and talked about his banking interests and his property in Cheyenne and his plans for expanding his land holdings. And Lena sat across from him and asked questions that sounded like interest and were actually intelligence gathering. He was not a stupid man. That was the uncomfortable part. He was calculating and self-interested, and he had found her family at their most vulnerable, but he wasn't stupid about it. He actually did believe, she thought, that he was offering her something reasonable, a stable life, a financially secure future, a partnership of practical convenience that many women in her position would have accepted without the ambivalence she was carrying. She might have accepted it herself, she thought sometimes, lying awake. If the dinner had been different, if her father had come to her first, had sat down with her and said, "Lena, I'm out of options. What do you think?" Maybe it would have been different, but he hadn't. He'd shaken a man's hand and called it a solution. And she'd gone out the back door in the dark, and a ranch hand with quiet eyes had asked if she wanted some air. And that small divergence had started something she didn't have a clean name for yet. Thomas Ashcroft noticed. Of course he did. Her father was not a perceptive man about most things, but he had a rancher's eye for anything that moved differently on his property. He started watching Wade the way you watch something you haven't categorized yet. He didn't say anything to Lena, not directly. Instead, he started giving Wade assignments. The first one was the North Well, a project that had defeated 2 previous attempts, involving ground that was rocky and drainage that fought back. He gave Wade 3 days and the minimum equipment required. Wade took 7 days, borrowed nothing extra, and got the well functional. Thomas didn't thank him. He moved on to the next assignment. The cattle drive to the winter pasture, normally done with 4 hands, he gave to Wade and told him to use 2. Wade reorganized the approach, picked Denny as his second, and moved 200 head across 12 miles of rough terrain without losing a single animal. Lena heard about it from Denny, not from her father, and not from Wade. When she found him afterwards, she said, "My father gave you 2 men for that drive. We managed. He gave you 2 men because he wanted you to fail." Wade was quiet for a moment, not defensive, just thinking. "I know. And you did it anyway." "The cattle needed moving," he said simply. "Wasn't about him." She stood there looking at him in the late afternoon light, this man who had been tested 3 times now, and had passed each test not by performing for her father, but by just doing what needed doing. Because it needed doing. And she felt something crack open in her chest again, not the same thing as on the porch that first night, something harder and more solid, something that felt less like hope and more like decision. She didn't say any of it. She wasn't ready to say it, and she wasn't sure any of it was safe to say. What she said was, "The east fence post. The brace you put in last week, check the footing again. The freeze-thaw cycle's going to work on it." But Wade looked at her for a moment that went a half-second longer than professional. "I'll check it tomorrow morning." "Good." She walked back to the house. The light was going down behind the western ridge, painting the snow on the peaks in colors that had no useful name, and the cold air smelled like hay and iron and coming weather, and she put her hands in her coat pockets and walked, and thought about cattle and fence posts, and the particular way a man could make you feel seen without ever saying a single word about it. The supper table that night was quiet. Her father ate with the satisfied expression of a man who believed things were proceeding correctly. Her mother passed the biscuits and asked about the fence repairs. Grant Holloway was coming again on Friday, her father mentioned, as though it were a pleasant event on the calendar and not a countdown clock. Lena said, "I know," and passed the butter and didn't say anything else. But that night, at the kitchen table with the lamp low and the house finally quiet, she opened the ledger she kept separate from the ranch accounts. Her own notebook, the one with the grazing rotation plan and the market projections and the 2-season recovery strategy. And she turned to a new page. At the top she wrote, "What I need, what I have, what comes next." She sat there for a long time, her pen moving slowly. She didn't have answers to everything. She didn't have a clear path through the situation she was in, not yet. But she had something she hadn't had the morning after that dinner, something small and hard and essential the way good fence wire is essential. She had a partner who showed up, not because he was told to, not because there was something in it for him, but because the work was there and the cattle needed moving and the lean-to roof needed holding, and that, apparently, was enough reason. It wasn't nothing. In fact, she was beginning to think it was everything. The engagement party was Eleanor Ashcroft's production from start to finish. She ordered fabric from town for new curtains in the parlor. She polished the silver that only came out twice a year. She made 3 different kinds of pie, practiced the placement of the dining room chairs until they formed a configuration she found satisfactory, and spent an entire Saturday morning arranging dried wildflowers in the good vases with the focused attention of a woman who had decided that this, the flowers, the curtains, the perfectly angled chairs, was the one territory where she still had complete authority. Lena watched her mother do all of it and said nothing. That was the specific cruelty of the situation. Her mother was not a cold woman, not a calculating one. Eleanor Ashcroft genuinely believed, with the whole weight of her generation and experience, that a financially stable marriage was the most solid thing a woman could be given. She had watched too many women lose everything to drought and bad seasons, and husbands who died young and left nothing behind. Holloway's money was real. Holloway's security was real. In her mother's arithmetic, that counted for a great deal, maybe for everything. Lena understood the arithmetic. She just couldn't live inside it. The invitations had gone out 3 weeks prior, the same families who had attended the dinner, plus a larger circle, the kind of guest list that announced something to the community. When Grant Holloway committed, he committed publicly. That was his way of doing things, she had come to understand. Public commitments were leverage. They made backing out costly for everyone involved, which was precisely the point. She had been watching him more carefully over the past weeks. The twice-weekly parlor visits that her father treated like board meetings and her mother treated like courtship rituals, while Lena sat in the good chair across from Holloway and asked questions that sounded social and were actually structural. She'd learned things. He was sharp about money in a way that was almost elegant. He could see a balance sheet the way she could see a pasture, understanding the health of the whole from the condition of the parts. He had opinions about the cattle market that were not wrong. He treated her, in those parlor conversations, with a kind of respectful attention that she recognized as genuine, or at least as genuine as a man could be when the woman across from him was simultaneously someone he admired and a financial instrument in a deal he'd already closed. She did not hate him. That would have been easier. What she felt was something colder and more clarifying. The certain knowledge that admiration was not enough, that respect from a man who had bought you was a compromised thing no matter how sincerely it was offered. And underneath that, something she had stopped pretending was anything other than what it was. She thought about Wade Mercer at inconvenient moments, not in a way she could have easily explained to anyone, not the obvious story, not the simple frontier romance. It was more specific than that and more complicated. She thought about the way he'd said, "We're not going to lose them about the calves and the storm," with a certainty that was not bravado, but just the next true thing to say. She thought about the 7 days he'd spent on the Northwell, asking for nothing, explaining nothing, simply doing the work until it was done. She thought about the way he looked at her when she was talking, with the full weight of his attention, like what she was saying was the most relevant thing in his immediate vicinity, which it usually was, because they were usually talking about the ranch, but still. She was not confused about what she felt. She was very clear about it. What she didn't know was what any of it was worth in practical terms, and Lena Ashcroft had spent her whole life in a world where feelings that couldn't be converted into practical terms were a luxury she mostly couldn't afford. The party was on a Saturday. It was the kind of late November day that came out bright and cold, the sky a hard clear blue and the frost still on the grass at noon because the sun never quite got high enough to burn it off. People arrived in wagons and on horseback starting at 2 o'clock. The Durans, the Kellys, the Calloway foreman and his wife, Judge Harder and his daughter, the minister from Harlan, 3 families from the Eastern Valley whose names Lena knew from church and the county records, and not much else. 30 people, maybe more. Filling the Ashcroft parlor and spilling out into the front room and the kitchen where Eleanor had set up a long table with food enough for twice the crowd. Grant Holloway arrived at precisely 2:15, which was a thing Lena noticed. He was never early enough to seem eager, never late enough to seem disrespectful. That kind of timing was a skill, the social equivalent of a well-timed market move. He shook her father's hand. He kissed her mother's cheek. He turned to Lena with the careful smile and said, "You look lovely," and she said, "Thank you." And they were both very good at their respective performances. She watched the room fill. She accepted congratulations. She answered questions about the wedding plans with the appropriate vagueness. "We haven't set a date yet. There's time." And deflected the more intrusive inquiries with the ease of someone who had been managing social situations on behalf of a distracted family since she was 15 years old. The ranch hands were not at the party. That was not a deliberate exclusion. It was simply the way things were. The invisible line between the house and the bunkhouse that everyone on both sides understood without discussion. Lena was aware of this in a low-level way throughout the afternoon, the way you're aware of something that is just slightly wrong about a room, even when you can't immediately name it. She was in the kitchen refilling the coffee service when the back door opened and Wade stepped in. He stopped when he saw her. She stopped when she saw him. "Sorry," he said immediately. "I was coming to get a wrench from the utility shelf. The pump fitting on the water trough. I didn't know there was company in the kitchen." There wasn't just then. The other women had moved back to the parlor, and they were momentarily, unexpectedly alone in the kitchen, which smelled like coffee and pie crust and the dried herbs her mother kept hanging over the window. "It's fine," she said. He looked at her for a moment. He was in his work clothes. He'd been doing repairs, clearly, making use of the afternoon when most of the property was otherwise occupied. There was grease on his right hand, and he was holding his hat in his left. "How's it going in there, Misum?" he asked. It was a careful question, not quite neutral. "Fine," she said again, which was not an answer. He seemed to know it wasn't an answer. He looked at her with that direct attention he always brought, and didn't accept the deflection the way most people would have. "You all right?" Something moved through her chest. A sudden, almost alarming pressure, the feeling of something that had been held very still for a very long time beginning to shift. She pressed it back down. This was not the moment. The parlor was 20 feet away. "I'm going to end it," she said. She heard the words come out of her own mouth and wasn't entirely sure she'd intended to say them. Wade went very still. "The engagement," she said, as if that needed clarifying. "I'm going to end it. Today. I think today is when it has to happen, while everyone is here." She stopped. "I don't know why I'm telling you this right now." "Because you've been carrying it alone," he said. Quiet, even. Just a statement of fact. She pressed her lips together. "Holloway's going to be furious. He's going to go after the ranch. He's already said as much. Not in those words, but the shape of it is there. He'll call the debt. He'll go to every creditor my father has and make sure the doors close." "Probably," Wade said. "My father's going to think I've destroyed everything." "For a while," Wade said. "Maybe." "That's not reassuring." "I know. I'm not trying to reassure you." He held her gaze. "What do you need from me right now?" The question hit her harder than she expected. Not because it was romantic, it wasn't, or it wasn't only that, but because it was so fundamentally practically useful, and because nobody in that parlor full of well-wishers had thought to ask it. "Nothing," she said. "I just needed to say it out loud to someone who wasn't going to tell me I was making a mistake." "You're not making a mistake. You don't know that." "No," he agreed. "But I know you've thought about it harder than anyone in that room, and I know you're not somebody who does things without understanding what they cost." He paused. "You know your own mind, Miss Ashcroft. You've always known it." She stood there for one more second. Then she picked up the coffee service. "Get your wrench," she said. "Yes, ma'am." She went back to the parlor. For another hour she circulated, refilled cups, answered questions, smiled at the right moments. Grant Holloway caught her eye across the room twice, and she held his gaze with the same composed expression she'd been wearing all afternoon. Her father was in fine form. Laughing, expansive, the most relaxed she'd seen him in months, because in his mind the deal was done and the weight had been transferred and everything was proceeding correctly. She watched him laugh and thought, "I love you. I'm about to blow up everything you believe you've built today. I love you anyway." Judge Harder called for a toast at 4:30. The room gathered, people moving in from the kitchen and the front room, clustering in the parlor where the good furniture was, where her mother's new curtains caught the afternoon light. Someone handed Lena a glass. She took it. Holloway moved to stand beside her, the way he'd been maneuvering all afternoon to be photographically positioned. The couple, the arrangement, the public declaration that made everything solid and real. His hand came to rest at the small of her back, light but definite. She stood very still. Judge Harder was a large man with a large voice who enjoyed the sound of both. He said something about the Ashcroft family's legacy, about the value of strong partnerships in frontier country, about the particular promise of this union. He raised his glass. 30 people raised their glasses. "To Lena and Grant," the judge said. To Lena and Grant, 30 voices repeated. And Lena Ashcroft said clearly into the silence that followed, "I can't marry him." The room took about 2 full seconds to process this. Then it erupted. Not loudly. The eruption was the particular sound of 30 people all drawing breath and turning and beginning to murmur at once, the sound of collective shock processing itself into social noise. Her mother's face went white. Her father turned to look at her with an expression she had never seen on him before, something between rage and vertigo. Holloway's hand dropped from her back. "Lena," her father's voice very low, very controlled, which was more frightening than if he'd shouted. "This is not the time." "I know," she said. She kept her voice level. She was very cold on the inside, the specific coldness of someone who has stepped off a ledge and is in the half-second before the fall begins, still deciding whether to regret it. "I'm sorry for the way this is happening. That's my fault. I should have said it sooner." "Said what?" Holloway asked. His voice was careful too, but the calculation in it had sharpened, all the social warmth stripped back to the structure underneath. "What are you saying?" She turned to face him properly. She owed him that. "I'm saying I won't marry someone I was promised to without being asked. I'm saying the arrangement between you and my father is between you and my father, and I'm not part of it. I'm not a fence line being sold off with the south pasture." She paused. "I think you're an intelligent man. I think part of you already knows this isn't right." Holloway looked at her for a long moment. Something moved in his face. Not fury, not yet. Something more complex. "Your father made a commitment." "My father made a commitment about my life without my knowledge or consent. He doesn't have that authority." She looked at her father when she said it. Thomas Ashcroft's face had gone through 3 different expressions in the span of 30 seconds and had settled into something stone-hard and unreadable. "I'm sorry, Dad." "You don't know what you're doing," her father said. "You don't understand what this means." "I understand exactly what this means." She said it without anger, without drama, just the flat truth. "I've been managing this ranch's finances for 4 years. I know what the debt is. I know what calling it will do. I know what Holloway can do if he decides to be punitive about this." She glanced back at Holloway. "And I'm still saying no." The room was very quiet now. The murmuring had died down into something more attentive. 30 people watching something they hadn't expected to see today. A woman choosing the hard thing in front of everyone, which was either admirable or catastrophic depending on who you asked, and the room was divided on that question along lines that would take days to fully map. Holloway set his glass down on the side table, very deliberately. The sound of it was small and final. "Thomas," he said, "I think you need to talk to your daughter." "I will," her father said, and the 2 words contained a promise that was not about conversation. "The debt stands," Holloway said. He said it to the room as much as to anyone specifically, making sure it was heard, making sure everyone understood the stakes he was repositioning. "Every arrangement I've extended to this family is conditional on the agreement we made. If that agreement is canceled," he chose the word with precision, "then I'll be pursuing what I'm owed through the appropriate channels." "I know," Lena said. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and for a moment the calculation fell away entirely, and she saw something genuine underneath, something that might have been a very controlled version of hurt. "I thought you were smarter than this," he said. "I am," she said. "That's why I'm doing it." The party did not recover. People began to find their coats within the next 20 minutes, the departure accelerating by the social physics of a room that has witnessed something too real for polite company to absorb comfortably. There were murmured words to Eleanor, who accepted them with gracious, numb precision. There were looks sent in Lena's direction that ranged from stunned to quietly admiring to deeply disapproving. The Durans left without saying anything to anyone. Judge Harder patted Thomas Ashcroft's shoulder on the way out and said nothing either, which was its own kind of statement. Holloway left last, with the composure of a man who had plenty of time and intended to use all of it. When the door closed behind him, the parlor was catastrophically quiet. Her father was standing at the fireplace with his back to the room, one hand on the mantel, head down. Her mother was clearing glasses with the precise, controlled movements of someone who needed something to do with her body, while the rest of her figured out how to function. Lena stood in the middle of the parlor, in the wreckage of her mother's new curtains, and 3 kinds of pie, and through her, now that the crisis moment had passed, the full weight of it dropping down on her shoulders. She hadn't cried, she wasn't going to, but she felt it all the same. "Thomas," her mother said very quietly. "Don't," her father said. To Eleanor, not to Lena. He didn't turn around. Lena went to the kitchen. She wasn't sure where else to go. She stood at the sink and looked out the window at the ranch in the late afternoon cold, the fence lines, the barn, the long slope of the east pasture going dark gold in the fading light, and she breathed. The back door opened. She didn't turn around. She knew the sound of those footsteps. "You heard," she said. "Most of it," Wade said. He stopped a few feet inside the door, not advancing, just present. "I was at the trough fitting when people started leaving." She kept looking out the window. "He's going to come for the ranch." "Yeah." "My father's not going to forgive me for a while." "Probably not." "I don't know how we get through the next season without that credit line." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "You've got a plan for that. You've had one for months." She turned then, because something in his voice made her turn. He was standing just inside the door, hat in hand, the same as always, nothing performed about his expression. He looked at her the same way he'd looked at her the night she'd gone out the back door in the dark, like she was a person making a decision that mattered, and the decision was hers to make, and he wasn't going to take that away from her by telling her how to feel about it. "You heard me say that," she said, "about the plan. I've watched you work it out for months," he said, "on the grazing rotation, on the winter feed numbers, on the market timing." He paused. "It's a good plan. It'll work. It'll be hard." "Yeah," he said. "It will." She looked at him for a moment that stretched past where it should have stopped. Something in the air had shifted, not dramatically, not with any of the signifiers that stories usually put on moments like this, just quietly and irreversibly, the way the temperature drops after the sun goes behind a ridge. They both felt it, neither of them moved. "Mercer," she said. "Yeah. I didn't do this because of you. I know that. I did it because it was the only thing I could do and still be myself afterward. I know that too," he said, quietly, without any edge. "I know that's why." She nodded once, turned back to the window. Outside, the light was going fast now, the frost coming back up from the grass as the temperature fell, and somewhere across the dark property, the cattle were moving toward the shelter of the barn, doing the thing cattle do when the cold comes in, finding the warmth they needed in a world that was going to be very cold for a while. "The water trough fitting," she said. "You get it fixed?" Behind her, she heard something that might have been the smallest exhale of a laugh. "Not yet." "Better finish it before it freezes," she said. "Yes, ma'am," he said. And he went back out into the cold to finish the work, because that was what he did. And she stood at the kitchen window watching the last of the light leave the ridge and feeling the full complicated weight of everything she'd just done and everything that was coming next. And underneath all of it, underneath the fear and the doubt and the knowledge of what Holloway would now begin to set in motion, something else. Something that felt, despite everything, like the first honest breath she'd taken in months. The first letter from Holloway's attorney arrived 11 days after the party. Lena was at the kitchen table with the account books when her father brought it in, still sealed, and set it down in front of her without a word. She looked at the envelope, the firm name embossed in the upper left corner, the particular quality of the paper that announced itself as expensive. And then she looked at her father. Thomas Ashcroft had aged in the past 11 days in the visible, specific way that real stress ages people. Not dramatically, not overnight, but a settling, a compression, like something structural had shifted. He'd spoken to her 3 times since the party, twice about ranch business, and once to tell her that Holloway had called on him privately and the conversation had not been friendly. He had not said, "I told you so." He had not said much of anything, which in some ways was harder. She opened the letter. It was precise, legal, and devastating in the way that well-drafted letters are devastating. Not through cruelty, but through clarity. Holloway was calling the operating line in full. 30 days. He was also, through his attorney, notifying two of the ranch's other creditors that the Ashcroft operation represented an elevated risk, a courtesy that was anything but courteous. Those creditors would be reviewing their own arrangements within the week. She read it twice. Then she set it down and smoothed the paper flat on the table with her palm, the way you flatten something you're going to have to look at again. "How bad?" her father said. Not a question exactly. "Bad," she said. "Not unsurvivable." She looked up at him. "Sit down, Dad." He sat. This alone told her something about where he was. Thomas Ashcroft did not sit when he was told to sit. He stood, he paced, he crossed his arms and looked at things from a distance. The fact that he lowered himself into the kitchen chair across from her without argument meant the fight had gone somewhere she couldn't easily see. She opened the ledger to the page she'd been working from for the past week. The plan, the one she'd been building in the separate notebook, the grazing rotation and market timing strategy, was now a necessity rather than a contingency, which changed nothing about the plan itself and everything about the pressure behind it. "Here's where we are," she said, "and here's what we're going to do." She talked for 40 minutes. Thomas Ashcroft listened in a way she had never seen him listen before. Not with the half attention of a man humoring someone he believed he already knew better than, but with the focused, uncomfortable attention of a man who was genuinely trying to understand something because he was out of alternatives. She showed him the numbers. She showed him the rotation schedule, the feed cost projections, the market window she'd identified for the spring sale. When she was done, the kitchen was quiet for a long moment. "Where did you learn all this?" he said. It came out strange. Not quite proud, not quite accusatory, somewhere between. "From you," she said. "From watching. From doing it myself for 4 years while you thought the foreman was doing it." He absorbed that. She watched it land, watched him work through the decision about whether to be defensive about it, and watched him decide not to be. That decision cost him something. She could see it cost him, and she respected it. "If we pull the breeding stock off the south pasture before the freeze and hold them on supplemental feed through January," she said, "we protect the herd's reproductive value going into spring. That's the core of everything else. We can sell everything else at the right moment, but we do not touch the breeding stock." "That's expensive feed through January." "Yes, and it's worth it. The breeding stock is the ranch's future. Everything else is recoverable." She held his gaze. "I need you to trust me on this." He looked at her for a long time. He looked at the ledger. He looked at the letter from Holloway's attorney. "All right," he said. Those 2 words were not nothing. In Thomas Ashcroft's vocabulary, all right from a position of having been wrong was the closest thing to an apology he was currently capable of producing. She took it for what it was. "There's one more thing," she said. He looked up. "I'm going to ask Wade Mercer to stay on through the winter. Full wages, back paid for the 3 weeks he's owed." She kept her voice even. "He's the best hand we have, and we can't afford to lose him. Whatever you think about, whatever else is happening, I need him here, and I need him to be treated correctly." Her father's expression did something complicated. She watched him move through it. "His wages come out of the operating cash," she said, before he could object, "which I've already accounted for in the projections. It's not a question of whether we can afford it. We can't afford not to." Thomas Ashcroft put both hands flat on the table. He breathed through his nose for a moment like a man counting something. "Fine," he said. She nodded. She closed the ledger. She picked up the letter from Holloway's attorney and put it in the stack of things that required responses, which was a taller stack than she would have liked. She found Wade at the end of the day, in the barn running a check on the tack that needed winterizing. He'd been at it since the afternoon, judging by how much was done, the methodical, quiet progress of a man who identified a job and worked through it without needing to be managed. She told him about the 30-day notice. She told him about the other creditors. She told him what she'd laid out for her father, the broad shape of the plan and what it required, and she watched him listen with the same quality of attention he always brought. Full, unperformed, real. "I need you to stay," she said. He looked at her steadily. "I wasn't planning to go anywhere." "I know, but I wanted you to know it's a choice, not an assumption. This winter is going to be hard. I can't promise the wages stay regular through the worst of it. You'll square it when you can, he said. Simply. I will. He looked back at the bridle he'd been cleaning. Then, yeah, I'm staying. That was the conversation. It lasted about 4 minutes, but something about saying it directly, making it a choice, naming it out loud, meant something to her that she didn't try to articulate. They married 3 weeks later. It happened the way certain decisions happen when the logic of a situation becomes undeniable from every angle at once. There was no grand romantic overture. There was an evening in late December when they were both at the kitchen table. He'd come in to go over the winter feed schedule. Her mother was already in bed. Her father had retired early with the worn-out look he carried most evenings now. And at some point the feed schedule was done, and they were just talking, the lamp low between them, the wind coming hard off the ridge outside. And Wade had said something about the north fence needing attention in spring, and Lena had said she'd already put it in the March plan, and he'd looked at her with that look she'd been filing away in some carefully organized interior cabinet for months. And then he'd said very quietly, I'd like to ask you something. She had looked at him across the table. All right. I know the timing is, he started, and then stopped, and she could see him searching for the right words with the same care he brought to everything, not willing to be imprecise about something that mattered. I'm not asking because of the situation. I want you to know that. I would have asked you anyway. I don't know if that matters to you. It matters, she said. Will you marry me? It wasn't flourished or decorated. He said it like it was the most straightforward true thing he could say, which she had come to understand was just how he operated. No ornamentation on the things that were real. She looked at him for a moment. She thought about the porch in October, and the storm, and the cattle drive he'd done with 2 hands, and the north well, and the kitchen on the day of the party, and every small, ordinary moment of work and attention, and that specific quality of being seen without being managed. Yes, she said. The wedding was under the cottonwood trees at the east edge of the property, on a morning when the cold had backed off just enough to make it bearable. Her mother cried with a complexity of emotion that Lena suspected would take years to fully decompress. Her father stood straight and shook Wade's hand with the specific formality of a man doing the right thing through difficulty, which was as much as she could ask for right now, and which was more than she'd expected. Denny and Corbett came. 2 neighbors who hadn't been at the engagement party, the Harmon family from the North Valley, who had a reputation for staying out of social politics and were therefore trustworthy. The minister from Harlan came and said the words and wrote the names in the book, and that was that. Holloway's second letter arrived the following Monday, as though the timing was deliberate, which it probably was. This one was from him directly, not from the attorney, handwritten, which she hadn't expected, and more personal in its precision. He was accelerating the debt timeline. He'd already spoken to the Harlan Merchants Bank, where the ranch had its primary account, and suggested a review of the ranch's creditworthiness. He was also, through what he described as a separate business decision unrelated to personal matters, purchasing 2 of the ranch's existing supply contracts, which meant the prices they'd been getting on feed and equipment were going to change. She read it at the kitchen table alone, early morning, before anyone else was up. It was, she had to admit, thorough. He wasn't just calling the debt. He was restricting the oxygen, cutting off the supply lines, flagging the credit, making the environment hostile enough that survival required not just competence, but a specific kind of relentless triage. He was betting that a newly married couple inheriting a collapsing operation would fold within a season. He was not wrong that it would be hard. He was wrong about the fold. She made a list, not a desperate list, a working one, the kind you make when the problem is defined and you need to move from understanding to action. Alternative feed suppliers. She knew of 2 in the Eastern Valley who didn't operate through Holloway's network. The supply contracts he'd purchased covered equipment and winter feed. She could source both at higher cost if she restructured the operating budget, which meant making cuts she'd been reluctant to make before but could no longer avoid. Wade came in at 6:30 and found her at the table. He poured himself coffee, looked at the letter, looked at her face, and said, "How bad this time?" "He bought our feed contracts." Wade was quiet for a moment. He sat down across from her. "Colton's Mill, over in the Eastern Valley. They still supply independent? That's already on the list. He nodded slowly. Colton's prices are higher. 12%. I've already run it against the budget. We can absorb it if we push the South Pasture yearlings to market 3 weeks earlier than planned and use that cash immediately. She turned the ledger toward him. Here. He looked at the numbers with the particular attention he brought to reading the land. Not fast, not performing speed, just genuinely processing. Then he nodded again. Yearlings will be lighter at 3 weeks early. 8% lighter on average. The price per pound on early November sale offsets the weight loss based on last 2 years' market data. It's not ideal. It works. He looked at her. What do you need from me? She almost smiled at that. He'd asked her the same question in the kitchen on the day of the party, and it had cracked something open in her then, and it still had an effect now, though she had learned to absorb it better. I need you to push the yearlings hard on the North Pasture for the next 3 weeks. Best possible condition going into early sale. And I need the breeding stock moved before the ground freezes, the way we planned. I'll start on the breeding stock today. There's something else. She hesitated, not because she was uncertain, but because she knew he wasn't going to like it. We need to let 2 of the hands go. I've been trying not to, Corbett especially. He's coming along, but the wage line is the only place I have room left to cut. Wade said nothing for a moment. She could see him working through the operational implications. Who could they run the property on? What would have to change in the work schedule? How much more would land on him personally? Keep Denny, he said. Let the others go. I can cover what Corbett was doing if I restructure the morning rotation. That's a longer day for you. I know what it is. He met her eyes. It's a longer day. She nodded. All right. The next 6 weeks were the hardest stretch of her life, and she had already lived through some hard stretches. The cold came in sharp and early that year, the kind of December that reminded you why people in frontier country were always one bad season away from losing everything. The water lines froze twice before they got the insulation sorted out. A section of the north barn roof failed under snow load and had to be repaired in conditions that made the work genuinely dangerous. Wade and Denny up on the roof in 20-degree weather, Lena below passing materials and watching the sky for what the clouds were doing. 3 of the breeding cows developed respiratory infections, and she spent 4 consecutive nights checking on them, treating them with what the medicine kit had, and supplementing with the additional supplies she'd sourced from the Eastern Valley at a premium that made her wince every time she wrote the number down. Her father helped. That was something she hadn't fully accounted for. Or rather, she'd hoped for it, but hadn't been able to count on it. But as December wore into January and the pressure built, and the work accumulated, Thomas Ashcroft began to show up in the way that men who've been good at something for decades sometimes show up when the crisis finally strips away the pride. He knew cattle. Whatever else he wasn't, he knew cattle the way you know something you've spent your whole life with. And there were moments in those hard weeks when his judgment on a sick animal or a feed problem was exactly right, in a way that her numbers couldn't fully account for. She didn't say anything about it. Neither did he. But something in the daily work of surviving the season together shifted the ground between them, quietly and without ceremony, the way most real shifts happen. One night in late January, she found him at the isolation pen where the 3 sick breeding cows were being kept. He was standing at the rail in the dark with a lantern, watching them. She came and stood beside him. 2 of them are better, she said. The 3rd is going to take another week, maybe 2. I know, he said. I checked their breathing an hour ago. He was quiet for a moment. This the roan's daughter? This one here? Lena looked at the cow. Yes. Her father nodded slowly. The lantern made the lines of his face very clear. He looked old in a way he hadn't looked 6 months ago, and she felt a complicated tenderness about that. Complicated because the hard season had been partly his making, and the tenderness was real anyway. She's got good bone structure, he said, about the cow. Her mother did too. Strong line. Yes, Lena said. She is. They stood there in the dark for a few minutes, not saying much, which was a form of communication they'd practiced all her life and were getting better at lately. The plan is working, he said finally. Came out gruff, matter of fact, the way her father delivered things that cost him something to say. It's working, she agreed. The spring sale, If prices hold where they've been trending, we clear the immediate debt and have a working margin going into summer. She paused. It's going to be tight, but we'll be here. He turned to look at her then. Not the sideways glance he usually used, but a full direct look, the kind she could count on one hand over the course of her life. I made a bad decision, he said. With Holloway. With the whole... He stopped, started again. I should have come to you first, before any of it. She looked at her father's face in the lantern light and thought about everything that statement contained. The years of not being asked, the plan that had existed in her notebook while he'd been looking for a man in a suit to hand him solutions, the dinner table and the handshake, and the guests celebrating something she hadn't chosen. You should have, she said. Yes. He nodded once. He looked back at the cows. She's going to be all right, he said, about the third breeding cow. Animals like that, they find a way. Lena looked at the cow. She looked at her father. She thought about Wade, out in the north section, finishing the evening check on the breeding stock in the dark, and the cold because that was what the day required, and he would finish what the day required, no matter what. Yeah, she said. They do. The March sale came in on a Tuesday, the kind of early spring morning that still had frost in the low corners but carried, underneath the cold, the first faint hint of what was on the other side of winter. Lena drove the wagon into Harlan with the sales manifest folded in her coat pocket and Wade beside her on the bench, and they sat side by side in the cold morning air and didn't talk much because there wasn't much left to say about it. They'd run the numbers enough times, they knew what they needed, and now it was down to the market and the buyers and all the things you couldn't control no matter how well you'd prepared. The yearlings went at a price that was $2 per head above her conservative projection. Not a windfall, a working margin, the kind that let you exhale and then immediately start calculating what came next. She stood in the sale yard with the receipt in her hand and did the arithmetic she'd been doing in her head for months. And when she looked up, Wade was watching her from across the pen. She gave him a small nod. He gave her one back. That was enough. That was exactly enough. On the ride home, with the sun properly up and the frost burning off the grass along the road, she felt the specific exhaustion of a person who has been holding something very heavy for a very long time and has just been allowed to set it down for a moment. Not permanently, not completely, because the work was ongoing and the recovery was a season-by-season thing, and nothing about ranch life ever simplified itself into ease. But for this moment, on this road, in the pale new sunlight of an early spring morning, the immediate crisis had passed. We're going to be all right, she said. Wade was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the road ahead, at the first pale green coming up along the ditch banks where the meltwater ran. Yeah, he said. We are. She looked at his profile. This man who had passed every test her father set without seeking credit for it, who had stayed through the worst of the winter without complaint, who had restructured his mornings and taken on Corbett's work and spent 4 nights helping her watch over sick cattle because the breeding stock mattered and everything that mattered was worth the time. This man who had never once tried to make any of it into something it wasn't. She reached over and put her hand over his on the reins. He turned his palm up without looking, and her fingers settled into his, and they drove the rest of the way home like that, through the pale spring morning, with the frost coming off the grass and the ranch waiting at the end of the road, still standing, as it turned out, exactly as she'd always believed it would. The spring that followed the hard winter was not gentle about arriving. It came in fits. 3 warm days, then a late frost that killed the first green shoots along the creek bank, then a week of rain so steady it turned the low pastures into something closer to marsh than grassland. The cattle stood in it with the resigned patience of animals that have survived worse, which most of them had. Lena pulled on her boots every morning and went out into whatever the sky was doing and did the work anyway, the same as always, only now when she looked up from the fence line or the pen gate or the supply ledger, there was someone who looked back. That part, the not being alone in it, turned out to matter more than she had words for. The first season of their marriage was not romantic in the way that word usually gets used. It was shared meals eaten fast, and disagreements about the timing of the south herd rotation that got genuinely heated before they got resolved, and Wade's habit of leaving his boots directly in the doorway that she tripped over 3 times before she said something about it, and her habit of restructuring the work schedule without telling anyone first, that drove him to the edge of his considerable patience on at least 2 occasions. They were 2 people with strong opinions and established ways of operating, learning to share a space and a life and a set of decisions that affected everything they both cared about. It was, in other words, real. Her father moved through the spring with a particular kind of quiet she had not seen in him before. He worked. He always worked. Thomas Ashcroft's one unimpeachable quality was that he showed up and put in the hours, every day, regardless of weather or mood or the state of his pride. But there was something different in how he moved through the property now. He watched more. He deferred sometimes in small practical ways, asking Lena about the market timing or asking Wade about the condition of the north section, instead of announcing his own conclusions and expecting confirmation. It wasn't transformation. It wasn't a man made new by suffering. It was something smaller and more durable than that. A man in his 60s beginning, slowly and at significant cost to his sense of himself, to adjust. She didn't require gratitude from him. She required the adjustment, and she got it, and that was enough. By June, the debt to Holloway's called line was cleared. Not completely. They still carried the restructured remainder on a payment schedule she'd negotiated herself through a letter to the attorney that had taken her 4 drafts to get exactly right. But the crisis number, the number that had been hanging over the property since the November letter, was gone. She crossed it out of the ledger on a Thursday evening and sat there looking at the crossed-out figure for a moment. Not with triumph exactly, more with the feeling you get when something that has been pressing on your chest finally lifts, and you realize how much pressure you'd been breathing around. Wade was in the doorway. He'd started coming in the evenings again, the same way he had back when they were still just partners in the daily work. Only now he came in and stayed, because it was his house too. And he looked at her face and said, "The Holloway number?" "Cleared," she said. He exhaled slowly. Nodded. Then he came and sat down across from her, and she turned the ledger so he could see the line, and they looked at it together in the way of people who have earned the right to look at a number together. "What's the next one?" he said. She almost laughed. That was so exactly him. Not "let's celebrate," not "we did it," just "what's next?" Because the work was ongoing and they both knew it. The feed suppliers. We're 12% above where we were before Holloway bought the old contracts. I want to renegotiate with Colton's directly. We've been reliable customers through a hard season. That has value. "It does," Wade said. "Colton's a practical man. He'll hear you. I'm going to take the account ledger. Show him the payment history." "Good idea." She looked at him across the table. "You could come." He raised an eyebrow slightly. "You need me to come?" "No," she said. "I want you to come. There's a difference." The corner of his mouth moved. "All right." The meeting with Colton went well, partly because Lena was prepared and partly because Wade said almost nothing the entire time. And that specific silence, a man who was clearly capable and clearly choosing to let his wife conduct the business, communicated something to old Colton that a great many words would not have. They came away with a rate 8% closer to what they'd had before, and a handshake agreement to review it again at the year's end. On the ride back, Lena said, "You didn't have to be that quiet." "I know," Wade said. "You could have contributed." "You didn't need me to contribute. You had it." He looked at her sideways. "I was watching you work. It's worth watching." She looked at the road. She did not say anything, but something in her chest did a thing she'd mostly stopped being surprised by, the specific warmth of being seen clearly by someone who has had many opportunities to see you at your worst and has arrived at a positive conclusion anyway. The summer was better. Not easy. Ranching was not easy, and this particular ranch had a deficit of deferred maintenance and thin margins that would take years to fully correct, but better in the way that momentum is better than stasis even when the work is hard. They hired Corbett back in July when the cash flow allowed it, and he arrived with the slightly sheepish energy of someone who knows they were let go through no fault of their own and isn't sure how to talk about it. Wade put him to work on the north section fence without making anything of it, and within a week it was simply a fact again that Corbett worked at the Ashcroft Ranch. In August, the roan's daughter, Tasikite Amas, the sick cow from the isolation pen, The one Thomas Ashcroft had stood watching in the lantern light on the January night he'd finally said, "I made a bad decision," produced a healthy calf. Lena was there for the birth, the same way she was present for most things on this property, and she stood in the barn in the early morning dark, watching the calf find its feet with the unsteady, concentrated effort of new things, and felt something she didn't have a clean name for, but that was close to the word continuity. This animal from that animal, from the animal before. The ranch going forward. She told Wade about it at breakfast. "Strong calf?" he asked. "Strong calf," she said. "Takes after the grandmother." He nodded, satisfied, and went back to his coffee, and she thought about how much of their life together happened in those small exchanges. The calf report over coffee, the ledger numbers at the evening table, the fence condition discussed on the walk to the barn, and how those small things were not the supporting material for the life. They were the life, the actual substance of it, and how she had not understood that before in quite this way. 2 years after the winter that nearly broke them, the Ashcroft Ranch turned its first real profit since before the beef prices dropped. It wasn't a large profit. It was the kind of number that made a banker shrug and a ranching family exhale for an entire week. But it was real, it was clean, and it belonged to them without conditions or compromises or anyone else's signature on it. Lena showed the final number to her father at the kitchen table, the same table where she'd shown him the crisis plan 2 years before. He looked at it for a long time. He'd aged more in 2 years. The hard winter had taken something from him that didn't come back, and there was a slowness to him now that she'd had to stop pretending was temporary. He spent more mornings than she liked sitting on the porch instead of working, which was not a Thomas Ashcroft behavior and indicated something his body was telling him that he was not yet ready to say out loud. He looked at the number. Then he looked at her. "This is yours," he said. "This, what you've built here, it's yours." She understood he didn't mean legally or practically. The ranch was the ranch, it belonged to the family, the titles were what they were. He meant something about origin, about where the survival had come from. "It's ours," she said. He shook his head, not disagreeing, but being precise. "I mean, I understand now what I didn't understand when Holloway was sitting in that chair." He stopped, looked at his hands on the table, the rancher's hands, scarred and competent, that had built this place from nothing 30 years ago. "I was trying to save it with someone else's money. You saved it with your own mind." She sat with that for a moment. "You built it in the first place," she said. "That's not nothing." "No," he said, "but building and keeping are different things. I was better at building." He glanced toward the window, toward the property. "Wade's good for this ranch. I want you to know I see that." It was by Thomas Ashcroft's standards an extraordinary thing to say. She felt the weight of it. "He knows what he's doing," she said. "So do you." He looked back at her. "You always did. I just—" He stopped again. The stopping, the inability to finish certain sentences, was new in him too. A man who had always spoken in declaratives, learning that some things don't fit that shape. "I should have asked you first, before any of it." "Yes," she said. "You should have." "I know." She reached across the table and put her hand on his arm for a moment. Not a long moment. Thomas Ashcroft was not a man who could sustain tenderness for long, without it becoming unbearable for both of them. But a moment. "We're here," she said. "That's what matters." He nodded. He put his other hand over hers briefly. The gesture of a man who has never been physically demonstrative, learning in his 60s that there are things words won't carry. Then he picked up his coffee cup and looked back at the ledger, and the moment closed, and they were back to business, which was the language both of them had always been most fluent in and always would be. The harder conversation happened 3 months later, on an October afternoon when the aspens along the creek had gone gold and the air had that particular clarity that comes just before the cold returns. She found her father on the porch in the middle of the afternoon, which was when she knew. He had a blanket across his lap, a thing she had never in her life seen Thomas Ashcroft use, and he was looking out at the east pasture with the expression of a man doing a specific kind of accounting. She sat down in the chair beside him. "Doc Hendry was out last Tuesday," he said without preamble. "I know. I saw the wagon. You didn't ask. I was waiting for you to say. He looked at the pasture for a moment. Hart, he said. He says I need to stop pretending I'm 40. He paused. I'm going to need to step back from the heavy work. He was pretty clear about it. She absorbed this. All right. The ranch is fine, she said. The ranch is better than fine. Wade and I have it. She looked at him. This is your home. Nothing about that changes. He was quiet for a moment. I want to see it go forward, he said. It came out rough, not sentimental exactly, more like a man stating a need with as little decorative language as possible. I don't want to. I want to see it still standing, still ours. It will be, she said. I promise you that. He looked at her then, the direct full look she could count on one hand. I believe you, he said. That was the moment she understood something that she hadn't fully understood before. Not in words. Even though she'd been living inside it for 2 years. The ranch was not just land and cattle and fence lines and balance sheets. It was the accumulated weight of every decision made on it. The good ones and the terrible ones. The ones made out of pride and the ones made out of fear and the ones made at kitchen tables at 6 a.m. when everything looked impossible and you did the math anyway and found a way through. It was all of that, layered in, the way geology layers in. You didn't see it at the surface, but it was load-bearing, every bit of it. Her father's bad decision was part of that. The dinner party and the handshake and the arrangement that had treated her like a debt payment, that was in there too. And so was the back porch in October, and the storm, and the engagement party, and the silence after, and the winter, and the March sale, and the crossed-out number in the ledger, and Wade's hands on the trough fitting, and the north well, and the lean-to roof in the sleet. All of it, every imperfect piece of it, had built the thing that was now standing. You didn't get a clean story. You got the story you actually lived, with all its wrong turns and recoveries, and what you made of it was the only part you controlled. She thought about this on a morning in the following spring, watching her father sit on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching 2 of the new calves run loose in the east pasture, while their mothers grazed with the eternal bovine indifference to everything that wasn't grass. He looked smaller than he used to, Thomas Ashcroft, sitting in the porch chair with the blanket that had become ordinary now. But there was something in his face that she hadn't seen there in the years when he'd been bigger, when he'd been the one carrying everything. A kind of peace, imperfect and earned, the peace of a man who has finally set down a weight that was too heavy and found that the world continued. Wade came around the side of the house from the direction of the barn, saw her standing at the corner of the porch, watching her father, and stopped. He read the situation the way he always read situations, quickly, accurately, without requiring explanation. He came and stood beside her, not saying anything, just present. He looks lighter, she said, quietly. He is lighter, Wade said. He handed something over. That does something to a person. She looked at her husband, this man she had chosen in the wreckage of an arrangement, who had never asked for anything he hadn't earned, who had stayed through the winter and the debt and the hard mornings and the longer evenings, and the arguments about scheduling and the boots in the doorway and all the ordinary difficult texture of a shared life, whose hands she knew the way she knew the land, whose silences she could read like weather, who still, 2 years in all the unglamorous dailiness of it, looked at her like she was the most relevant thing in his immediate vicinity. "What are you thinking?" he said, because he'd noticed her looking. "I'm thinking about a dinner party," she said. He raised an eyebrow. "And a back porch. And a man who asked if I wanted some air." She looked at him. And how different everything would be if he hadn't. Wade was quiet for a moment. He looked out at the east pasture, at the calves running the crooked, joyful loops that young things run when the spring air hits them right. "I'd have found another way to say it," he said. She looked at him. "Whatever I needed to say," he said. "I'd have found another way to get there." He said it simply, the way he said all the things that were real. "You're not easy to walk away from." She stood there in the spring morning and felt the full, complicated accumulation of everything she'd built and lost and rebuilt and fought for and chosen, and felt it settle. Not into perfection, not into the uncomplicated happiness of a story that ties off clean, but into something better than that. The specific, grounded peace of a person who made the hard choice and lived inside it long enough to find out it was right. Her father said something to the calves from the porch, some low, wordless sound, the instinctive communication of a man who had spent 60 years around cattle. One of the calves paused and looked at him with the flat, curious look of young animals, then went back to running. Thomas Ashcroft laughed. It was a small laugh, surprised out of him, but it was real, and it carried across the yard in the clean spring air, and Lena heard it and felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't known was still held. She had not saved this ranch so that someone else could inherit it. She had saved it so that it could go forward, so that the calves in the east pasture could grow into the herd that would still be here 20 years from now, so that the fence lines she and Wade had rebuilt in the sleet would hold long enough to need rebuilding again, so that the kitchen table where she'd done the math in the dark would still be the place where the next set of problems got solved by whoever came next. That was the investment. Not Holloway's money, not the credit line, not any of the financial architecture that people in suits believed was the load-bearing structure of a life. The investment was in the people who showed up, who stayed, who did the work, not because it was profitable, but because the cattle needed moving and the fence needed holding, and the family at the end of the road was worth the cost of a hard winter. You couldn't put that on a balance sheet. She'd tried. The ledger had no column for it, but it was the only number that had ever actually mattered. The east pasture glowed in the morning light, the new grass coming up thick and green after the wet spring, the calves cutting loose circles across it while Thomas Ashcroft watched from the porch and Wade stood in the yard beside his wife, and the cottonwood trees along the creek edge put out their first pale leaves, reaching toward the light. The way things do when the long cold is finally over and the season has turned and everything that survived is ready, once again, to grow. The Ashcroft Ranch stood. It would stand. That was enough. That was everything.